one question you may have is, why is somebody from Datadog talking about reporting? The way I thought about it is when I think about what we do, and by the way, what we do is observability as a service, analytics about performance and availability for applications running in the cloud. When I think about it, it's ultimately some form of reporting, and we do that for a living, right? So it's some form of reporting because we're talking about observing what's happening in your stack, looking at transactions, consuming vast amounts of data, and then providing some kind of condensed version of it, so you can understand what's going on. Now, where we may be a little bit different from you is this is our bread and butter, and so how well we report matters immensely. How effective, how fast you can find the answer by looking at our dashboards, responding to alerts we send, sometimes to PagerDuty, it is really important to our core use case. So we get to invest a lot. We sort of test and experiment, and so in that sense, I've certainly learned my fair share of lessons in terms of reporting. Not to say that we do it perfectly, but there's hopefully I can share some of what I learned. And why enterprise? Why am I here on an enterprise topic? Is we started in 2010, and back then it was cloud natives, tech startups. We sort of probably along the way graduated to hipster enterprises, which are great to work with. And then also moved on to traditional enterprises as customers. And so traditional enterprise is, I think we heard about the beauty business in the Midwest, generating $1 billion in sales per year. It could be healthcare, banks, and so on and so forth. And so now, as we continue to grow, we onboard more and more of these guys. And so I hear on a regular basis what it is that they want when they talk about reporting. So one way that I was thinking about, well, how do we think about it internally? And so going back to first principle, it's really thinking about what are the questions that reports are designed to answer? What are the questions that users are going to have when they want to use your reporting features? And answers, in a sense, what answers you'll produce, it sort of comes second. And once you start thinking about what questions do they have when they come to your product, to your report, fundamentally you get to a natural tension between open-ended reports and sort of pre-canned reports. Open-ended is really I want to ask a lot of different questions. I don't really know which one it is. And on the other hand, pre-canned is, here's the report. It's on an email. It's interactive or maybe not even interactive. It answers very specific questions in a very specific way. It formats. It really constrains how you think about the data that you're consuming, and that's that. And so you'll face that tension. When you think about reporting for your own product, you'll face that tension. You will think, do we need to build open-ended, or do we need to build a lot more pre-canned? And so I think in reality you'll need both. But one way to make a decision there, which way are you going to lean, is to ask yourself, well, who's asking, right? What's the role? What's the persona, if there's such a thing? What's the context of the person asking? And then you ask yourself, well, let's say we produce the answer. Would they be able to understand it? Would they be able to understand it, right? And lastly, now I give them the answer. What are they going to do with it? And I think when you ask yourself sort of these three questions, you get to an important piece, which is what is the intent of the person asking for the report. In some cases, in enterprise software, sometimes you'll have oh, I need reports, my boss needs the report, and ultimately what they don't say is because, and I'll produce the report on a weekly basis because this makes us look good, or this justify the purchase of the tool. And you shouldn't discount that. I mean, it's an important piece. It shouldn't be everything, but you'll see that definitely. And you'll have other cases where, and sometimes it's the same person with different contexts, sometimes totally different people, saying, well, I need to do a deep dive into data that you have on my behalf. And because maybe I'm doing, I want to validate some theory, and that's obviously gives you a more of an open-ended answer to the report should be really open-ended. And ultimately, you'll find everything in between. Now, we as Datadog, obviously, we find ourselves much more in the deep dive, open-ended camp, obviously, because if our users are highly technical, there's a ton of data to consume, they face novel problems, infrastructure and applications fail in novel ways each time. And so there's a lot of this quick cycle of open-ended, ask you questions of the data, I get an answer, and I continue until I'm done. And then we also produce a plane of graphs because the brain is really good at consuming really tons of data in a compressed fashion through the eye and the brain behind it. So let's take a look at how we approached Openended. So Openended, one of the key issues that exists with it is what I call the blank sheet problem. And so on the left-hand side, you have a Datadog dashboard. Once you say create dashboard, it's full of promise, but you're like, okay, now I can create I could drop widgets, I can create graphs. Where should I start? What should I graph first, for instance? And so that's great, but it's not a great first experience. If that's all you provide out of the box as reporting to your user, they're gonna be like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll come back. And the reason for that is that they won't have an intuition of what the report can do, or in this case, what the dashboard can do, what your reporting can and cannot do. So the way we worked around that for open-ended reporting is we provide a lot of examples you can play with. You start with a template, if you will, and you can modify it. You can learn by copying. And I have 2 young kids, and one thing I've learned from them is that you learn a lot by copying. They see you do things and they replicate. And I think ultimately you don't lose that as an adult, and it's still a great way to learn is just see what's been done, make some modifications, and kind of move on and graduate. And once you've learned, once you have an intuition of what the reporting tool can do, then you can face the blank sheet, and then you say, okay, yeah, I know, I want this and that, slice and dice by these dimensions and so on, and then you're in business. But you need to work through that first phase. If you provide your user an open-ended reporting platform, you need to work through that initial phase, hand-holding phase. On the other end of the spectrum, if we look at precanned reports, which is, here's the answer. This is really how it goes. It's not even what is the question, it's directly here's the answer. One of the problems we've seen with that, so it's obviously very easy to consume and you kind of constrain the problem a lot. So in that case, it's desirable. One of the issues we've seen with precanned reports is they tend to die. In other words, they live as long as you invest time in keeping them up to date. And otherwise, there's this long and sometimes slow, sometimes fast spiral of death where you've built this great report, you send it every week to your users, and then your data set become richer, but the report falls behind. And then maybe you measure open rate through email, and you see that open rate so gradually decrease. And it's like, maybe it's not as valuable as before. And when you think about investing in, well, should we bring it up to date? The data will tell you otherwise. Data will tell you what's less and less used, because actually it's less and less useful. So you'll tend to put it on the wayside. Yeah, maybe it was an experiment. It was useful, but we were not going to invest in it. So precanned report have in themselves this almost this weakness that they're really good at conveying information where you want to provide the answer and not have the user really think hard about the questions to ask. The problem is they get out of date really fast. And so we thought about a couple of ways to prolong their lives, what I call escape hatches. One is, which is pretty common, is common ask is, hey, can you give me a CSV extract? Dump it in S3 and so on. And that's fine, that's relatively easy to do. It's not a heavy investment. The problem there is you're giving your users work. It's like, okay, here's a CSV, good luck. And it'll only work with the very dedicated users, because they'll have not only to figure out what the analysis they want to do on the data, but also have to import the data, and keep it up to date and so on and so forth. The other a second escape hatch we found is building open source integrations to reporting tools, third-party reporting tools, because maybe that's what data analysts use it for a given one of your customers. They use R, they use Tableau, and so on. So that's usually it's a nice one-off investment, and it sort of sidestepped the pre-canned report is frozen. It's ultimately going to die. But it'll go so far. There's only a small fraction of your audience who's going to respond to that. So, and then there are other ways to think about it, to sort of not essentially have build reporting that's not valuable, that's not used. So if you step back a minute, you think so you have, I'm sure you have backlogs of features you want to build, and my guess is reporting is not, so there were some brave souls who say, yes, I'm excited about reporting, but generally speaking, it's not top of the list. It's not what makes or break the company. And so one way to think we thought about it is, well, what's in it for us? Why do we, yes, customers are going to ask about reporting, but why even build it? Why not say no? Why does it matter? And so one way to rationalize it, and we found a way to rationalize it, is to say, well, reporting is actually a great way to bring people back into the product, and this particularly is true for SaaS platforms, and that justifies the investment. For us, that totally justified the investment. And so we thought we discovered two hooks that help you bring people back in the product via reporting. For us, they're alerts and they're what we call AI generated story, AI with quotes in this slide. So alerts, so you use Datadog, you plug it in. Basically, alerts is a way to tell you in the middle of the night, usually in the middle of the night because it's more pleasant. Hey, I have a problem. Your phone rings like the system is going down. You need to fix it. And so that's a very powerful way to bring people back into the product. But only if they expect it. You can't. You wouldn't send. You wouldn't page somebody to say, hey, your weekly report is ready. Wake up. That doesn't work. So in some use cases, and that's for you to think about, your particular context, it's a very powerful tool. It works all the time. The downside is you have once you go down that path, you have a very high quality threshold. You really need to get your alerting right. When you notify the user to bring them back in, you need to get it right, because otherwise they'll just slowly discount you. Their trust in you will erode. So that hook is extremely powerful, and it lasts forever if you spend a lot of time in it. So the other hook we thought about and we started to deploy is AI, which for us is a way to say anything from statistical processing, machine learning, and it lets us. It's an interesting play on open-ended versus precanned, because it's precanned in the sense that AI is a system that tells you, hey, this is what I found in the data, and you didn't ask a question. It just says, hey, this is what I found in the data. It's open-ended in the sense that you, by whatever algos you deploy, you control the questions it asks. And so you have we found it a really interesting way to have reports that evolve over time, don't necessarily require investment, but are not completely open-ended. The quality threshold here is pretty high, but for different reason. The issue with this kind of hook into reporting is the last thing you want to do is your AI system to generate work for your users. And by that I mean you get a report, you look at it, it's like, I don't understand how the machine could come up with this. And then all of a sudden now you start, your users, basically you gave them work. Whereas you wanted to give them answers, now you give them work, potentially a lot of questions which they may not be able to answer. So there are ways about it. Obviously, when the machine generates an insight, it says, you may be interested. Now you should do this because of the quality level that exists. And generally speaking, whenever we put AI inside of reporting, we err on the side of being conservative, or the false negative. In other words, we don't tune the system to report on everything it finds. We'd rather miss a few things, but only maintain trust by putting forward things that matter and that make sense. Now, there are reporting must-haves as well. So what I talked about is a little bit of where you have a lot of latitude and control, and you can decide which, where in the spectrum of open-ended to precanned you're going to fall. But there are things you're going to have to do no matter what. And here I misappropriated the common joke. There are only three hard things in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and printing web pages. And we've spent an inordinate amount of time trying to produce PDFs that look like the web page, like the fonts are not right. And it feels like so infuriating. But the truth is, you're going to have to do something like that, because in the world of enterprise, usually not hipster enterprise, kind of PDFs still reign supreme as a way to share information. It's what it is. I'm already happy that people are not printing emails anymore. So that's baby steps there. So you're gonna have to spend time there. You're gonna have to spend time doing things like IP whitelisting, which in the world of Beyond Corp and Spiffy doesn't make a lot of sense. But nonetheless, for traditional enterprises, you want to have the ability to say this report will only be accessible from the following ranges of IP. And that's relatively easy to do. But you'll have to do it. And maybe you'll be like, oh, but that doesn't make sense. Well, for a number of people, it does. The last thing, I think that's been talked about, well, not last thing, but one of the must-haves also is SAML, SSO, and then usually SAML. That's something that we found having to do early on and for reporting, and you'll have to do that. And the last must-have, which is really a topic in itself, it's role-based access control. Who can see the report and what can they see? And so here this is something that's going to come up like almost immediately in terms of, some enterprise customers like, okay, great, I send you all this data, you do some wonderful stuff with it, and I want reports, but who can see them? Because if the wrong person in the organization can see them, we have a problem. So our approach there has been ultimately to try and defer. It's like, no. Well, you don't say no, you say, yeah, interesting, And so there are ways to do it. It's like it's the enterprise package, it's more expensive. Or you say, interesting, you'll put on the roadmap, talk to you next year, kind of thing. And because the reason why, for reporting in particular, it's RBAC is, we try to defer is because it's friction, particularly when it's very granular. And it kills certain patterns. For instance, when I talked about open-ended reporting, where you want people to explore the data that you have and slice and dice and learn by copying things, the RBAC gets in the way. RBAC kills conversations because now I talk to somebody, they can't see the data, you're dead. That kills that conversation. And it's super tedious to set up. So one way we found that works is you do what I call requirements jujitsu, which is no, RBAC is not what you want. You want to break down silos. It's sort of Jedi mind trick. You don't want RBAC. And ultimately, when you push sometimes, it's not like they want to control who has access. They just want to know who looked at the data. So it's more of an audit trail. Ultimately, should we surrender to RBAC and implement? The answer is probably yes, and we're in the process of doing that. Last thing before closing is what I call meta reporting, which is reporting on how your users are using your product. And this is great because, and it's often overlooked, but it helps with adoption, especially in the enterprise where the big risk is not that your product doesn't have the right feature. The big risk is that it gets, it's left on the side because there's too much stuff going on. And so building reports about how well people use who uses your product and how well they use it actually helps your champions. It helps them justify, look, there's traction, but we got to go see this team to help them understand the value of the product, and then they'll get on board. So parting thoughts, reporting is, when you think about it deep down, it's not very different from your core use case, whatever it might be. You're generally gathering data, and then you want to answer questions. You want to answer questions that your users have. Now, to guide how to design that, again, I think the things to think about is, if I'm building reports, who is it for? Can they understand the answers that it produces, and what are they going to do with it? Generally speaking, I'd say keep it open-ended because it's more fun, it's more flexible. But if you do so, be aware of the blank sheet, and it could become discouraging. But ultimately, think about reporting also as a way to re-engage your users, to bring them back into your universe on a regular basis. Thank you very much.